I'm like, man, I keep getting outbid. And my realtor, she was in her late 70s. She's like, you know what? She's like, go after the condos because none of the investors are looking at those, and you can get them for like pennies on the dollar. So I started in condos because I didn't have any competition. And my first one was a 2-bedroom, 2.5-bath condo for $26,000.
Yeah.
And she's like, put a roommate in there getting $500 a month. She's like, that's going to cover your whole mortgage. And it did. It was like my mortgage was $475. So all I had to pay was bills and HOA dues. But that really helped me get one property a year. And that's
another episodes of Lessons into Blessings podcast. I'm your host, Tari Thomas. I have with me on the show today, Tom Brickman from Dallas. He is an investor, went from starting at a movie theater all the way to building out his rental real estate portfolio to over 24 units, became a millionaire at 31 and financially free at 40. There's so much nuggets that he has to share with us. So welcome with me on the show, Tom Brickman.
Thank you for having me. That was quite the intro and the build-up. I hope I can. Share some knowledge.
It's the little things, man. It's the little things, and it's the little things. I know it took you a while to kind of, gather that portfolio. You've been in real estate for like 19 or so years, and real estate is not a get-rich-quick scheme. It takes time, right? And so, definitely want to. Just jump into just how you got started and how you were able to continue to build over that and maintain, right? Like there's some people I know that 2000, kind of when the crash happened in 2008-7 period, that they wiped out and they never got back in, right?
I was the idiot that just stayed the course. And I'm like, I don't understand. Everyone's panic selling around me. And I'm like, hey, I'm still collecting $300 a month on this one. I'm keeping it.
Right.
So,
and we're going to talk about that, even the buy right. Right. And so I tell people all the time, like, you can weather, if you buy right, you can weather any storm. And so we'll talk a little bit about just buying right. And maybe that's where we'll jump in, is just, how were you able to maintain? You can tell us a little bit about how you got started on your real estate journey, but then also how are you able to maintain through the downturns?
For sure. So I started out of stupidity at 21, and it was not like I'm going to be a landlord. Real estate is the way. It was more of, gosh, my rent's getting high. And at the time I was paying $375, and I'm like, I got to find something cheaper than this.
Right.
And yeah. So I worked at Gap/Old Navy at the time, and my salary was $8.50 an hour. I was a senior in college. So all my money was going to rent and to food, basically, that I wasn't covered with tuition reimbursement, which Gap had at the time, which is why I stayed with them through college.
Yeah.
And I went to go get pre-qualified, and they're like, you can basically buy nothing. They're like, but if you get this multifamily, we can use the rent from it to approve you for a higher amount. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'm doing that for sure.
Nice.
Like I want 100,000. So I was approved for 100,000. My down payment came from Gap stock, which I started purchasing right when I started working at the Gap.
Smart.
I cashed that all in, and it was really like at that break even where I had made nothing and I had lost nothing on it. It was steady, and I'm like, I'm going to cash this in and use this as my down payment. And I found a multifamily, and it's door 1 and 2 in my portfolio. I lived in the ugly upstairs unit. My grandma came out and looked at 3. And this was the one that I threw in because I'm like, well, if grandma's going to drive all the way out, I got to show her at least 3. And she was a realtor.
Yeah.
But I remember standing on the front porch there, and she's like, this is the one, and you're going to live in that ugly small unit upstairs because you can get a lot of rent for this nice one downstairs. And I'm like,
that's nice.
That's not what I want, but okay, I'll do it. You don't want to mess with grandma, especially at that point. So
exactly. So you kind of stumbled into the house hacking strategy, which is what you do, which is, buy a property. You can house hack with a actual single family house by renting out rooms, or you can house hack by buying a multifamily, living in one and renting out the other ones. And so you stumbled into that, right? So the bank told you about the strategy of, hey, if you rent one of these, this is one way you can qualify.
Yeah, we can get you a much better approval amount if you rent. And I'm like, all right, I'm doing it. And My mortgage, tax, and insurance at the time was $738, and the tenant downstairs paid $600. So I'm like, man, I can live for $138. This is perfect. This is where I want to be. And I learned real quick that it was more than $138 when the furnace went out that first winter. I'm like, I had to hustle real quick to find that.
These capital expenditures.
Ill prepared.
That nickel to the bank.
But I muddled through and I figured that out. And a lot of how I figured stuff out early was I used eBay as my tool, and I would flip products, and I would go to Goodwill, and I would go all around town and just find inexpensive items. And I started with purses, and that was how I paid for a semester of college. I would get tuition reimbursement for tuition, but books and parking passes and all that was never included. So that was my way to figure out how to pay for that. So I hustled really hard that winter to get that furnace in. Luckily, we had enough space heaters to get us through the 4 or 5 days for them to get it ordered and installed. I love it. But you learn real quick
where do you think you picked up that hustle kind of culture? Like, I think you're tapping on something that, one of the things that, like, you have to have flexibility and adaptability when you're an investor. Like, you don't know what's going to come up. So kind of where did you just learn to have that knack? Was it always kind of in you? Or?
Yeah, it was in me. And I was basically taught if you want it, you have to work for it. So I was mowing lawns at 10 and 11.
Got it.
I was just like that side hustle enthusiast. I'd go help people with garage sales and get cuts. Like I always had some hustle. And then I think my first job was at a restaurant at 14.
Wow.
And I just kind of stuck with it. I started at Gap at 16, and I kept the restaurant job for a couple of years.
You kept it moving. That's
just
good
always,
stuff.
If I want it, I'm going to have to work for it. So that was my mentality, and I didn't have any more time to put into it. So I'm like, maybe eBay would work. And this is right when this is early 2000s when eBay was just like starting to roll out.
Just getting to get.
It didn't even have buy it now. So I'd sell 2 purses a week, and I bought them for $1.50, and I was selling them for like $60, $70, and I'd ship them out and do it over and over and over again.
Wow.
But it adds up when you do that.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. That's good stuff.
That was
so. Now, where did your journey take you? That's kind of how you cracked in. You said, "Oh man, there's something to this." What did you decide? How did you decide to kind of keep rolling that? Once you kind of striked, like, "Oh, I can make money at this."
So I was cocky, and I took a no down payment loan in 2005 in Cleveland, and it was a terrible purchase, and I owned it from 2005 to 2015. And I ended up losing a lot of money on that one because I had no interest. This is exactly why the financial crisis happened, was because of this. Like, I remember at the closing table signing like loan documents, and I was like reading things on there as I'm signing, and I'm like, this says I make like $100,000. I don't, but is it too late to stop signing? And I signed away. So that was a bad purchase, but I kept it until I had paid down the mortgage enough, and I sold it. And at that point, it was something that I had bought for $85,000, and I sold for $63,000. And I was just happy to get that dud out of my life. And really that stems back to, I went into a market, I didn't know anyone, I didn't have any plan, I wanted to be closer to family, and it just didn't work out that way. So
that's good. Flesh that out a little bit, because the show's called Lessons into Blessings, right? And as investors, we have lessons that we learn along the journey that actually help set us up in the future, right? Because, I take nothing as a failure, right? Everything is something that I can learn from and grow from. What do you believe that you took from that? You can kind of share with our listeners that you took from that. That's good tips you can give back to other people, or things that you kind of for the future, set you up for the future. Because it's like, okay, I'll never make that again. I'll always read all the documentation. What are some of the tips you feel like people could take away from that?
The big lesson here was my family was closer. I was going to lean on them. And then when push comes to shove, I always got the last resort. They were never there when I'm like, hey, I've got a leak in the house. Can you fix this? Hey, I'm here. And I hear that a lot when I talk to people. They're like, oh, I'm going to invest here. I have family in this area. That's great, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're a member of your team. They're a great family. They can be verbal supporters, but when you've got that leak or that is where it went awry. And I had evictions. I had to set out after an eviction. It was just like kind of a mess from start to finish. And whenever I would fix something there, something else would always break. So that was like a lower income property.
Got it.
And a lower income area. And I invest in those still, but I have a team in place now.
That's good.
And that's really where I feel like I messed up in that was, 1, I bought with no money down. 2, I didn't know what I was signing until I was sitting there at the closing table getting handed keys. 3, I didn't have any team in place. So I didn't have anyone for even just like, can you go over and check this? So I lived in that house for a year, and then they're like, hey, do you want this job down in Texas? We'll move you back in a couple months. And I'm like, yeah, I guess I can rent this. And I'm happy with the decision to move down to Texas, but I still had this house with no team. And what I had in Toledo was a bunch of college friends, and one of them was a plumber and one of them was an electrician. So it was like I could muddle through the duplex.
Yeah, absolutely.
In Cleveland, I just didn't have any support. So it was a mess. And
So really, take away from that, always have boots on the ground.
For sure. And take anything that you can get, like even like a photographer or something, anyone that you know that you have networked with can help you out of these sticky situations. And I remember that in Toledo, where I'm down in Texas and I'm like, hey, this is broken. I know your husband does HVAC, but can he go check this? And she's like, yeah, he can go over. And it worked out that way. So boots on the ground is huge. And understanding what you're buying, because I was just blindly buying. However, I was making a little bit on my duplex out in Toledo, so it floated me. And then I got transferred down to Texas, and I went to apply for a loan. They're like, hey, you already have 2 mortgages, and this is in 2008, 2009. They're like, you have to pay off your debt before we do anything. And I had like $17,000 in credit card debt.
Yeah.
So my hustle in Texas was I went and got a second job, and I worked at Ross, and I folded clothes, and I did Ross for a year, and my credit card was all Citibank, and there was a Citibank across the street from Ross. So I would like take my check, cash it, and go just hand it every 2 weeks. I'd hand them this check, and it took me about a year. So my first purchase in Texas was 2009. And I learned very quickly real estate was very different in Texas than Ohio.
For sure.
And it was very, like, I think I probably bid on like 10 or 11 at the time. And these were low price houses. They were in the 70s, and now they're in the 300s, 400s.
Right, exactly.
But I'm like, man, I keep getting outbid. And my realtor, she was in her late 70s. She's like, you know what? She's like, go after the condos, because none of the investors are looking at those, and you can get them for like pennies on the dollar. So I started in condos because I didn't have any competition. And my first one was a 2-bedroom, 2.5 bath condo for $26,000. And she's like, put a roommate in there getting $500 a month. She's like, that's going to cover your whole mortgage. And it did. It was like my mortgage was $475. So all I had to pay was bills and HOA dues. But that really helped me get one property a year. And that's what I started doing in 2009. Every year, it's like, okay, I want to buy another one, And then there were years that I bought 2 or 3 because of the prices. So
I love that.
Hard for a while.
Yeah, no, I love that, because I mean, you're pretty much showing people how to get started. And I'm a big enthusiast. I'm a house hacker too. I could go into that, but house hacking really, especially when you're young, it really gives you the ability to be able to get into a space and just start getting your hands dirty and learning, right? So I'm definitely a big believer of educating yourself, but even a bigger believer of like, just get started, and while you're doing it, you're going to learn, right? And so I think in jumping into the house hacking strategy, not only, I mean, as a college student, right? And you were able to find a way to put just enough down. And now I think Fannie Mae just brought back a policy where you only have to put 5% down now for units up to 1 to 4. So now, in more expensive markets, you don't have to come up with that as much down as you used to as an investor, coming up with 20% or 25%. So that's a big game changer if you can make the numbers work. I'm going to add that caveat, buying it right.
For sure.
And so back to your story of just like, you were able to rent a room and get that whole mortgage paid. And then you just built that strategy of buying one house every year, which is steady. You were steady Freddie or steady Tommy,
Yep.
however you want to say it. But I mean, that's a good strategy. You slowly build your wealth over time.
For sure. And I, at the time, I think I was making in the low 30s, the low 40s, upper 30s. So eBay was still my background. Like, I had stopped working at Ross because I had paid off my credit cards, but eBay was still a backdrop, and always that was what pushed me over to be able to afford the down payments or to be able to afford the properties. So that was always the go-to to kind of get me through. So the side hustle is always what kind of pushed me over, because the money earned at my job paid the bills, but didn't have that extra for the down payments. So that was a focus of mine for all those years. And even now I'm sitting in my eBay room and I still do it. And I call it my safety blanket. And whenever I have like I had a really expensive August, and it was just like money going to air conditioning and foundation and this and that, and it was just nonstop. So I'm like, you know what? In September, you should see my eBay sales, because they went like way up like this, because I just like started listing really hard. And I don't even source that much. I'll bring in some stuff, and then I'll go sourcing for a day and just list it. And
there's something to be said about that. So really good so you use the eBay thing to kind of set up somewhat of a reserve account, right, for your rental properties. And that's really extremely important, because I think when we do the numbers for any sort of rental properties, we take out all the expenses that we know, right? Like the debt payment and the taxes and the property insurance and, maybe to fix small little things. But we don't always take into account and say, hey, I bought this property. It's in the 60s or it's in the 70s. The roof is 15 years. The AC is how many years old? Probably over the next 5 years, I'm probably going to have a couple big ticket items go, and building a reserve just in case that having that ready, because if you don't have that ready, that's another thing that can wipe you out. And
I had my emergency fund, but these were like, the air conditioner was a 2020 air conditioner. So so I certainly didn't think in 2023 I'm going to need to throw a new one in.
For sure.
And I had bought this during COVID, and I went with a brand that I never go with. And sure enough, they're like, oh yeah, we can't warranty that. I'm like, of course you can't. This is why I don't buy your brand. And I only bought it out of desperation because everyone else was out. But I had that emergency fund ready. But a lot of the things that popped up this year weren't the CapEx stuff. Because, I am like, okay, I've got a 10-year-old roof. I've got a 15-year-old roof. It's time.
Yeah.
And that's important. I like that you bring that up, because so many people are like, okay, I have $50,000 to put down and do this. And I'm like, okay, if we put down this $50,000, do you have a $10,000 set aside if this breaks or the plumbing goes or this or that? And they're like, no, that's all my money. I'm like, then let's say you have $40,000 and do this right, so you're not like a mess when the first furnace goes out or foundation crumbles or whatever it is. So I think that that's important for people, because it was a mess when I was trying to figure it out and get that furnace that first year. I was 21. I was just
when you're young, absolutely. But I love the fact that you had to experience that early, because that really set you up. And even with the eBay thing, it's like, okay, worst comes to worst, I know I can hustle, for a good month or so and knock it out, right? Mm-hmm. So it's important to have that in the back of your head, that it's something that could come up.
And I think people and that's what I say, I got creative, because you don't have to do eBay. Like, I have a friend that does cookies. I have a friend that walks dogs. Sure. There's a million different ways to generate income that doesn't cost a ton of money. And eBay, for me, I never put myself into debt. Like, when I'd go source, I'm like, okay, I've got $100 today, or I've got $200.
Yep.
I was never the one that's like, okay, I need to go buy $20,000 worth of Nikes. Right. I was buying like the $2 bottles of lotion and flipping them for $10 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And that's important to stress to people as well too, because they're like, how do you get funding for eBay? And I'm like, well, I mean, I reinvest some of the profit, but the majority of it goes into real estate. So I've never been I've never been one of those that like has gone crazy with $100,000 worth of merchandise at once. And that's what worries me when the people are teaching these Amazon courses and they're going into $10,000 in debt for this and that. Crazy. And I'm like, that's not my method. So I have Amazon presence, but I've never really aggressively sold on there. I have a few items. I ship a few items every month. And that's kind of been how I've done this. Good. And I bought
now you're up to 24, right?
I am.
Something like that.
I've started doing trade ups. So if this one really doesn't make sense, sell this one off, exchange it.
Explain trade ups for our audience.
Sure. So
because I know what you mean, but yeah.
Sure. So 2010, I bought a little condo for $14,000, and I rented it for 10 years. And in 2020, I'm like, all right, I have had it with this. This one always has these issues with tenants.
Yep.
It's time to trade this. So I put it up for sale. I ended up selling it for just under $100,000. So crazy that it was $14,000 10 years ago, and now it's $100,000 in 2020. Right. And then with that $100,000, instead of paying the capital gains on the income on the sales price, I rolled that over into a multifamily 2-unit property. Yep. That produces way more than what the single door would do. So
love that.
Where I'm at is some of the original stuff in my portfolio. It's had a good run. I've depreciated it for 10, 15 years, whatever it is. And then I trade it into another property that's producing the income.
And you use, I'm assuming you use a 1031 exchange to do that?
Yeah, 1031. Sometimes it doesn't make sense, and I've just cashed out and
that's smart.
Pay the gain.
Well, that's a good right there. So let's tap on that, and then I'm going to dig a little deeper, because that's very good. Sometimes it makes sense to just take the hit now. Okay, maybe you have to, especially depending on how much gains you're going to get, right? And obviously talk to your tax strategy. But how did you make the decision between trade out of this property to another property with a 1031, or just take the hit now?
I made that mistake. So it took me and that's what a lot of my journey was. It takes me making this mistake, and I was trading up a $50,000 into two other $50,000. However, when I went to go sell one of those $50,000 doors, they're like, the value is $3,000, so I had a bigger,
so it's much
bigger hit. Yeah.
Sure.
So I have learned from that, and I strategically do 1031 exchanges, but there is one that I did this year, and I ran it through my account, and I'm like, should I do this, or would this make more sense? And gave him both, and he's like, oh yeah, looking at your taxes from last year, this one makes way more sense than going this direction. So it took me messing up and doing an exchange that I shouldn't have done, which would have had a very small tax implication, as opposed to doing a 1031 on a property that all day makes sense. And people are automatically, I need to do a 1031.
I know, they assume it, right? They assume it, but it doesn't always make the most sense. So definitely talking with an accountant or tax specialist, because absolutely there's times where it's like, well, and depending on what you have to write it off against, right? Based upon the year, I know people who strategically set it up so that, hey, when I sell this, I'm going to be able to write it off against X, Y, and Z, items. So there's strategy to that too. So that's pretty good. I'm glad that you're tapping on that.
For sure. And some miss that. And that's why, I made that mistake. It was an expensive mistake, but I won't do it again. Yeah,
exactly. Man, you're giving us tons of lessons.
I've learned the hard way, though. So that's why I share.
Good. And that's the beauty. That's the beauty. You've learned, and you've been able to write. It's not like it took you out, right? It was enough of a pain to be able to say, okay, this is how I'm going to strategically set up the next one, right?
For sure. And anytime somebody brings me a property in Cleveland, I'm like, oh, I learned the hard way there. No, thank you. Keep on going. I know plenty of people over in Cleveland that'll buy that now, but it's not going to be me. So it takes me learning some of these the hard way to know, oh, maybe Cleveland isn't the market for me. Oh, maybe I shouldn't do a like-kind exchange. Maybe I should just sell it and strategically do it. So that's a lot of what I'm doing at this point with my 24 doors, because I am producing enough income from them, but some of them are bigger. When you look at the graph and you see, okay, every month I've got money going out to this one, and it's a very hard property to maintain, a very hard property to keep a good paying tenant in. Maybe I don't want this headache in my life. Maybe I trade it into something else and I think that people need to look at that too, because it was a big deal for me in 2015 when I finally sold that one in Cleveland. I'm like, man, it's so nice not to have this headache in my life. And people are like, yeah, but you could have 100,000 now, 120,000. I'm like, you don't understand what that did to me for 10 years.
Because time freedom is a thing too, right? Like financial freedom, yay, we made it. But now it's like, hey, I want some more of my time back, and I don't want the pain and the headache, right? So
that
absolutely
should be mentioned because people don't see that. I don't care that it's worth $100,000 now or $120,000 now. I know that it did not drain me anymore since 2015, and someone actually DM'd me on Twitter and they're like, hey, I just bought this house. I saw you owned it before. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you bought my money pit. And I was like mind blown. But they are an investor. And I said to him, I'm like, I wish you luck. I saw that they hadn't done anything since I sold it. And he's like, well, we're doing a bedroom and we're going to do this and the rent's this. And I'm like, I hope you have better luck than I had on this one.
Right. And they
more power
may.
to you.
And
right.
that's the, one person's, what seems like a headache to another person is another person's joy. So, and I love the fact that you traded up. You said, hey, this asset, it makes more sense to turn it to double the income, or maybe I'm only getting 50% more, or whatever that percentage is. But it makes sense to trade it up to maybe a different class of neighborhood. So maybe going from a C to a B, or a D to a C, depending on kind of where you invest. And completely, I make that decision too. I started buying condos as well because it was the cheapest thing to do. And it's like, hey, the market's going to all rise together, right? So let me just find the cheapest thing where my money can be working for me, and ended up then trading that up into a fourplex, right? And so I completely love that strategy. I think that's a great way to continue to be recycling and making sure that you're kind of still progressively making more. And another thing, because you're like, hey, I got a salary from this, right? And so it doesn't, a lot of people think, oh, it's got to be 1 million doors, right? Like you don't have to have that many doors for it to make sense and to become a salary for you, right? And so right. I like how you analyze, okay, here's my spreadsheet of properties. Which properties have the most outflow of expenses, money I'm putting towards capital improvements or whatever, and how much are those properties bringing in, and doing those assessments maybe on a yearly or a bi-yearly basis, where you're making that, you're doing that analysis to say, okay, yeah, maybe, in the next year, I want to be able to trade this up into X, Y, and Z. So I love that you're making those a
minimum of once a year, but yeah. I should be doing it twice a year. And you can really see it when you have all the numbers in front of you. You're like, man, I am negative on this one again this year, and I was negative on this one last year, and it's going out more quicker than it's coming in. So why am I holding this headache in my portfolio?
Right.
So I think that's important to hit home. And that's also, so I pivoted away from Dallas in 2018 when I was just getting outbid on everything. And I'm like, I'm not going to go cash flow negative like some of these investors encourage people to do. And that's when I went back to Ohio. And that is how I was able to make the cash to be able to leave my job, because I have a lot of great assets in Dallas and they are appreciation rich, but their cash flow is tiny, even though I've held them for 10 years. And I went back to this more, I would say, a more value market, where I have a lot of C properties. The cash flow is great on them. And that's how I kind of really accelerated. And I was ready to go in 2019. And I stayed at my job out of self-doubt for another 2 years. And I regret that decision, but shoulda, coulda, woulda. And it did get me a lot of great properties during that 2 years. I bought a hoarder house that's one of the best in my portfolio in Texas that I would have never been able to get if I didn't have that job. So I kept the job. And
that's a smart thing to just say right there too, is a lot of people feel like, I want to, like, it's not about leaving your W-2. If you love your W-2, stay on your W-2, because your W-2 helps you buy properties. And like, even me is just, I'm self-employed and business owner, and it's a different process to buy when you're not a W-2 employee, right? You don't have those pay stubs. They require that you have to be 2 years. You have to be able to show tax returns for 2 years as a business owner. You really have to show a lot more proof for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to be able to approve you for these investment properties. So I've had to get really creative and use commercial loans for some of my fourplexes and things like that, just to be able to overcome some of those challenges. But I remember hitting like I was like 18 months out of my W-2, and it was like, like they would not accept them. Like, I'm really close. So, once again, going back to that flexibility, being adaptable and finding out what works. And so I love that you went back to Ohio, which is definitely less of an appreciation market, but definitely a cash flow market. And I think the Midwest and the South are really great markets for cash flow. And Dallas probably at one time was, right?
Mm-hmm. I was making the same in Ohio and Texas, but that was early, like 2010.
Right, exactly. When that was
pick up properties at the same price. And I even remember that in 2010 when I was buying, I'm like, I could buy one in Toledo for the same price or this one. I'm like, well, Dallas is going to go up more, so I'm going to put my money into this one in Dallas. So yeah, I stuck in Dallas till 2018.
Yeah.
And
but I like that you made the shift. It's to say, hey, you know what? Based on the strategy that I want, I'm going to have to find flow into a lower price point market that still cash flows really well to be able to achieve what I want to achieve, right?
Right. And when I did a spend analysis, and I'm like, I've got great properties, the appreciation's great, but the appreciation is not going to pay the bills. So I'm like, I need to find one that I'm making $500 a door, whatever it was at the time.
Yeah.
And when I went back there in 2018, I was doing at least one a year, but there were a couple times that I do 2 or 3, or I buy a 4-plex, and that moved the needle enough that I'm like, oh man, okay, I'm making it now. This is working. The numbers are working. The loans are working, and this is it. I can do this.
Yeah. Let me ask this question, because you're talking about just acceleration and what accelerated and moving back to a higher market. What do you feel like is your superpower that you stumbled into to say, okay, I've been doing this for a few years now, and this is my like pattern, this is my rhythm. A lot of people struggle with there's a million real estate strategies out there. They struggle with, well, what am I going to do? I could do this. I could wholesale. I could flip. I could, but how did you really hone in on your superpower, what you bring to the table, and like what strategy you were going to go focus on?
I focused on other investors that had issues, and I'm like, hey, how can I help you fix your issues? So even this year, I bought 2 properties that are owner financed, and one of them was, nice. I was driving down the road, and I'm like, he was doing a clean out, and I'm like, are you getting ready to sell this? He's like, man, I've had one too many bad tenants here. He's like, this is going up. And I'm like, can I take a look? And he's like, right now, no, but I'm going to be back over here on Saturday. And I made the drive back out there on Saturday, and he was there working on it again. And I'm like, hey, I could take this problem off your hands. You don't need to do any of this work. When I went inside, there was a ceiling caved in where an air conditioning thing. And I basically, by talking to him, I was able to say, hey, will you owner finance me? Hey, will you do it at 6%? Because you're going to get more money. You're going to get what you want. Plus, you're going to get 6% interest on it for all these years. Then you can spread your capital gains over multiple years, and just the ability to sell it that way. And that sealed the deal with him. We were off market. We were, he doesn't have to pay any real estate fees. He doesn't have to fix anything. And just showing him the value. And same with another one that I purchased this year. I went to the seller and I'm like, this house is busted. No bank is going to give me any money. I said, I can't take on this deal. And he's like, how can I make this work? And I'm like, finance me. I said, every penny I have has to go into fixing this house. And he's at 3% when everyone else is at, 8%. Wow. And he's happy because now his problem is off his hands.
Yep.
So connecting directly with the sellers has been something that I've focused on the last couple of years, as opposed to bidding against 10 other people who are bidding on the same property as me. And I've worked with wholesalers, I've worked with cold callers, I've done all that, and that has worked really well for me this year. But that hasn't been my strategy over the years. But where I'm at in my journey, that's what I want. I don't want to bid against 10 other people.
Yep.
And when I work with people, when I work with clients, they're like, nothing makes sense. I'm like, I know, we need to find you something off market so you're not bidding and you're not overpaying. Because when you buy in Ohio, if you overpay, it can be 10, 20 years till you get back up to the value. That property that I bought in college for $90,000 is now 120. If I had overpaid,
wow.
It has tiny little appreciation over the years. And in 2009, if I would have done what everyone else was doing, I would have sold it for 45 because it had fallen in half. And that's what the duplexes were selling for. But my rents didn't decrease, so I just kept collecting rent, and it was a cash flow positive property for me all the years that I owned it.
Yeah, there were so many nuggets in that. number one, if you can give a tip on how you I love that strategy of how you focus on investors' pain points. Because right now there's a lot of investors with a lot of pain. How do you like find those people? Are you kind of
the investor that is doing the owner financing that I went back and took the paint off, I was driving for dollars. I was actually just driving around. I was looking for an estate sale that was going on, and I was two streets over from where it was supposed to be. But at the same time, driving for dollars, when you see an overgrown house that's beat up, and this guy was literally hauling stuff out of his garage, I'm just like, hey, I'm going to stop and say hi.
Yeah.
Hopefully he doesn't shoot me. We're in Texas, but I'm going to say hi. And I found through Facebook groups, that's how I found the other distressed property. They have like just distressed properties on there where people are like, I inherited this house, I don't want it. Like, that's a gold mine right there. They have a house that they don't want, and you have money and you want that house. So there's a lot of those opportunities. I also find contractors that way and build my team that way through those Facebook groups, because people will respond. They're like, hey, I don't want this house, but I'll come and do your landscaping, or I'll come and do this. So Facebook groups, driving for dollars, and networking with other investors. So I've sold properties to other investors. So I'm just like, hey, I have a couple others in this area, and I've bought from other investors as well. So whenever I do that, even I was sitting at the closing table last year, and the guy's like, hey, I've got this one and this one I'm thinking about putting up. Are you interested in either one of them? So it's one of those where as the more you're in it, the more you're going to learn. My photographer up in Ohio is like, hey, I'm taking pictures for this guy. He's going to list it. It's going to be off market though. Do you want this? And I'm like, yes, thank you. This looks like a solid property. I just had a client close on a really nice brick duplex that our HVAC guys like, hey, this lady's done dumping money into this house. Do you want it? And I'm like, yeah, that's a great property. Why would I not want an all brick duplex?
Let me tell you, those references and referrals are priceless. And I think people don't even realize how much their connections and the people they're connected to and the groups they're a part of, how much that just opening your mouth is like, look, I buy these properties. Like, if you know of anybody, you know, talking to I have a locksmith, like, hey, you got to change locks for people, contractors. I think that's phenomenally great, because that's how I picked up properties too, is just relationships. My best deals have come through just relationships, just people knowing that you're out there looking for these types of deals. You know, people who are like, look, I'm done. I'm ready to tap out.
For sure. My best deal came from, I would buy nail polish for eBay, and the guy out at the flea market would sell it to me 3 for $1, and I could easily sell them for $8 a piece. And I gave him a card, and a few years later, he's like, hey, my mother-in-law was a hoarder. I inherited her house. Do you want this? It's a mess.
Wow.
And I'm like, yes, I want that. And that was because I was buying nail polish. You know, it wasn't like a real estate conversation at all. It's like, hey, this is what I do. I sell nail polish and I buy houses. And he knew when he had that house that he didn't want, he's like, hey, I'm going to ask him if he wants it. And it's a great house.
Yeah.
So I think that forming any kind of relationships, and whenever I meet someone, I hand them a card. I know it's old school, but I keep cards in my pocket just so that if they do have a house or a divorce or something comes up, they're like, hey, can you take this off my hands or help me fix this issue quicker? So being quick, being friendly, and being memorable, because that was the thing. I would always bring him coffee. He was like the first stop, so we'd stop at McDonald's, and then I'm like, here's your coffee, and that just made that sale. I know that was part of the factor.
That's good. Being memorable, man. So that's good. You really do have to be memorable.
People ignore that stuff, and that's the stuff that gets the deal over the finish line a lot of the times.
No, that's good.
And being flexible. The one that I took earlier this year that he's doing the owner financing, we're like, we don't want to have to evict your tenant. I know he's not paying. He's like, well, it's going to take me a few months. I'm like, we'll wait a few months. If we need to wait till this to do it. He was owner financing us, so it wasn't like it was blocked. So you know what? My money will sit and earn 4% interest in the bank while you're doing this. That's fine. And we'll have this house that we want. So,
man, I love the seller financing strategy. I think that's definitely, while people were able to take advantage of all these 3% and 6% and all these rates, or people who just own it outright and clear, There's definitely there's the wraparound strategy if they still own something on it, or assuming the loan, and or the seller financing. So I love the creative strategies right now. That's something that I'm like trying to hone in and find, as well. So I definitely believe in today's market where we're at with these high interest rates, since a lot of stuff is not penciling, you still have to be able to get creative on how you're locating and finding these deals, because they're out there still, right? So
For
it's
sure.
just about how do you shift and make the adjustment, just like anything, any business, making the adjustment to be able to set yourself up for success. So I love that. So this would not be Lessons into Blessings, which you've already given us a ton of nuggets. But it would not be Lessons into Blessings if we didn't ask about one hurdle or obstacle you've had to overcome. And it's a lesson that you've learned that you've been able to turn it into a blessing to continue to create success in real estate for you.
Okay, so it's actually going to go back to that hoarder house. When
Okay.
I couldn't even open the door, and I had initially told him, I'm like, this is too much. This is a bigger project than what I can handle. And he owed like 120 on the property at the time. And he's like, can you bring another investor? And I took this other investor. He's like, I can give you 100. I'm like, I can't take less than what he owes on the property. So I went back to him and I'm like, the other investor, no, but let me figure this out. And I took a personal loan out on my name because no one would loan me money on this house. It had holes in the roof, but it was in the great location, and it was really risky and scary, and I had the money to pay it back, but in the middle of that hoarder house, it was 11 40-yard dumpsters. All my money was going to like getting the garbage out of the house.
Wow.
I know, it was insane. So I stepped in and I started doing this stuff because I ran out of I didn't have any money to pay anyone. So I'm like, I'm not going to put myself into more debt. I already have a personal loan that I'm paying on. And it was not fun. And it was a really hard couple of months because everything I made from eBay just automatically went into the paint or into the light fixtures or whatever I would. And at that time I was just listing like crazy. I'm like scanning stuff that I'm sitting next to on the couch. I'm like, we don't need this, sell it. And that turned into a blessing because it's one of my best performing properties. It's one of the strongest in my portfolios. And it opened up doors. Like I went to my credit union. They're like, oh, we can give you a guidance line with this house. If you have this house, we can write you on any other property because you have this one. And it just opened up doors. So it was a really, really tough 6 months of emptying it, fixing it, renting it, getting it finished and over the finish line, because it was like everything that could go, everything got replaced. Every single piece, ductwork and HVAC and roof and windows and everything. But it opened up doors that I would never been able to gain access to had I not gone through that 6 months and had this certain property in my portfolio.
And what are the gems that, obviously looking at the location, it was in a great location. Somebody else, it couldn't work for anybody else, right? So identifying properties that don't work for other people. How can I add value to this property that doesn't work for other people, where I can negotiate it at a good price, it's in a good location, maybe the ugliest property on a good block? And what were you able to now achieve? You talked about the bank giving you a guidance loan. I don't know what that is, but what on the flip side now have you been able to achieve by finding those diamonds in the rough? I call it a diamond in the rough, right?
I can easily...
or maybe the opposite, a rough in a diamond area.
For sure. That's exactly what that one was. It's made me open my eyes when I'm analyzing deals to deals that are poorly listed, because right after that one, I remember there was a listing and it was for $75,000. This is up in Ohio, and it was a 4-unit, but it was listed as like 5,500 square feet as a 1-bedroom, 1-bath, and no pictures. And I'm like, 5,000 square feet, there's got to be more bathrooms and bedrooms in there. This sounds wrong. And sure enough, it was just the owners were about to lose it to a foreclosure or a tax foreclosure. And I would have normally passed over that had I not done this Like it's opened my eyes to seeing other opportunities that I was ignoring before. Because I would have typically scanned right by that and been like, no, it's 1 bedroom. That's not right. And those opportunities are still out there too. There's a lot of people who are like, I'm having my daughter list this for me, even though she's not in this market, and she'll throw up a poorly listed property or a picture or a property with no picture. And those are the opportunities that I still see floating through. Yes, it was ugly, hard, and it took a lot of work, but that's where you can make a lot of money too.
Yeah, that's good. No, that's good. Awesome, man. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for just being on the show, sharing, dropping the nuggets for us. How do people reach out to you? I know you have, you do the House Money Media and podcasts and courses. How can people find you?
Yeah, so I'm at the Frugal Gay 11 on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and or X if you want to call it X. And same with I'm at House Money Media on all of those as well. So can connect through me either way. We have a newsletter, we have a podcast, we have a courses available. So either of those you can reach me at.
All right, no worries, man. Well, thank you for having you on the show. And for all of those folks that tuned in to listen, until next time, stay blessed.
Thank you.